I'm just moments away from revealing what I believe is the most accurate version of D.B. Cooper's flight path. Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Ulis here. All right, let's get right to it. Let me go ahead and put up a copy here of the flight path as I see it, the most accurate version of D.B. Cooper's flight path, and there it is, traced right on top of the very famous FBI yellow map. Of course, it's the blue line that I believe represents the actual flight path that D.B. Cooper's jet took on that night, the night that he jumped, of course, skyjacked Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. So, first of all, let me give you an idea of how I managed to put this thing together and why I think it's the most accurate version of the flight path, and frankly, why it's important. So to begin with, from the word go, the first thing I tried to do was really just sort of wipe away every preconceived notion I had about all this stuff and really take a cold, hard, objective look at this challenge with respect to the flight path, because I've long believed that the FBI's version of the flight path is flawed. It's flawed in some way, and it's really primarily for a couple of reasons. One, because a portion of the ransom was found in 1980, $6,000, 3 packets neatly stacked right on top of each other, buried in the sand at a place called Tina Bar, and it's reflected on the map here, the money find spot. And as you can see, it's nowhere near where the FBI shows the jet flying. That's a very big problem, because where the money was found is effectively on an island. And it is obvious to me, as someone who's spent an enormous amount of time in that area there, it's obvious to me that that money was buried there by a person, in all likelihood D.B. Cooper himself, on the night of the skyjacking. It makes an awful lot of sense. He has to temporarily bury the money before he walks into town. Can't be carrying a 20-pound bag of cash with $200,000 in it unless you want to get arrested like that. So that makes a lot of sense there. And again, the FBI flight path is very problematic because it's nowhere near where the money was found. That's the first thing. The second thing is that that FBI flight path area and the drop zone, the area where they believe D.B. Cooper jumped and therefore landed along the FBI flight path, has been searched and researched and researched many times over the last 52 years. And they have found absolutely nothing to indicate the man was ever there. No parachute, no money, no body, no shroud lines, nothing at all. And that's a very big problem. This isn't Antarctica, folks. It's, as you can see, there's a fair amount of population that lives in this area. It's around, Vancouver, Portland area. So there are a lot of, hunters and people engaged in recreation. Again, like I said, there have been actually law enforcement itself has searched that area extensively. They actually found 2 dead bodies while they were searching for D.B. Cooper, believe it or not. So it's not like, this area hasn't been searched. It's been searched extensively, and not a single shred of evidence has ever been found to prove that D.B. Cooper was ever in that area at all. Now, on the other hand, the money, different story. Found nowhere near where it should have been found. And, I've heard a lot of exotic theories of how that money ended up buried, how those 3 packets ended up buried in the sand, about 50 feet from the water's edge at an elevation about 7 or 8 feet above the level of the Columbia River, normally. These explanations are really not even worth seriously entertaining. I'm very familiar with that area. I know where the money was found. I know the condition the money was found in. That money was buried by a person, period. Simple as that. Occam's razor right there. There you go. And again, with all certainty, it was D.B. Cooper himself. So as I started considering this, I started to, I thought, okay, you know what, there's 3 things, there's 3 criteria that absolutely have to be met. The flight path, the true flight path, has to account for the following 3 things. First of all, has to account for the money find at Tina Bar. In other words, D.B. Cooper, I believe, landed very near where that money was found, within 1 or 2 miles. So the jet has to get reasonably close to that area to explain how D.B. Cooper could jump off the back from 10,000 feet up and under his parachute canopy drift and end up within a couple of miles of where the money was found in Tina Bar. That's the first thing. Absolutely has to be met. The second thing relates to what I believe was a piece of evidence that was found from the jet back in 1975 near Cinnabar, Washington, and you can see at the very top of the map, I have, Cinnabar hunting grounds. Well, there was a hunter back in 75 who apparently found one of these, sizable fiberglass panels that broke off from the back of the jet. He found it just kind of laying in the woods there as he was hunting, and verified that indeed it came from 727 in that back air stairs area above the, rear air stairs door, which is, those pieces were gone when that jet landed in Reno. So that has to be accounted for as well, because if you look at the FBI flight path up there, up north, you can see that it's many, many miles away from the Cinnabar area. And it is just simply physically impossible that the piece would have broken off from the jet as it's flying at 10,000 feet up, which is under 2 miles. It's under 2 miles in elevation, but somehow managed to drift 15 or 20 miles to the northeast. That's just impossible to occur. Again, there wasn't a hurricane taking place that night. It was a little breezy, of course, but nothing like that which would have been required to have that piece drift off for 15 or 20 miles so the hunter could find it years later. The flight path, the true and accurate flight path, had to account for that piece in my mind as well. And the third criteria here relates to the air traffic controller, who unbelievably was never interviewed by the FBI. Make of it what you will. I don't know. They just dropped the ball on that. They should have interviewed Seattle air traffic controller, who managed not only the 2 F-106 chase planes out of McChord Air Force Base, but he also managed the T-33 Oregon Air National Guard jet that departed from Portland and ended up circling around behind the Skyjacked airliner. And he also managed the Skyjacked airliner as well for a period of time. So he was paying close attention to what was going on there, because he was obviously managing the entire scene there. So his recollections of things that occurred that night and where they occurred that night are important, and they have to be factored into the big picture, the overall flight path. So let's start from the top of the map. So you'll see that I have a red number 1 there. Well, that red number 1 there is an important location because it signifies an area called the Malay intersection. It used to be called the Mayfield intersection, but today it's called the Malay intersection. Now, I have long believed that D.B. Cooper's jet actually flew over that Malay intersection, which is precisely where the Victor 23 airway, the airway that the jet was on, passes over. And I've long felt that he actually flew over that. The reason why is because that would help explain, if he's actually flying to Malay and makes a turn at Malay, that explains how that piece of fiberglass ends up near Cinnabar, Washington. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the FBI's map, the FBI's version of the flight path on the yellow map there, which is again right near that number 1 as well, just on top of it there, that's basically Toledo. It made a turn, according to the FBI, at Toledo, and that's quite far away. Now, when I spoke with the air traffic controller, a gentleman named Cliff Ammerman, by the way, Cliff told me that, without saying anything at all, he said the jet turned at the Malay intersection. It made the turn at Malay intersection. And and why this is remarkable and noteworthy is because this was, he had just gotten handed the F-106 chase planes, basically, that were behind, at least 6 miles behind the Skyjacked airliner. And he was watching this. He was watching his screen, which again is just a black screen. It doesn't have all the, it's not the map. The screen that he was looking at, Cliff Ammerman was looking at, doesn't have all these things displayed on it like this yellow map. It's just a black screen that kind of shows the line of the airway that the jet's traveling on. It shows where the Portland airport is located. That's it. It doesn't show the Columbia River. Doesn't show buildings or roads or anything else of that nature. So it's clear that we have an understanding of kind of what Cliff Ammerman's looking at here. But he says he was told at the time that he was handed the airplanes, the F-106s specifically, that he did not know, that they didn't know the direction where the Skyjacked airliner was going to go. Now, it had been cleared to take this Victor 23 airway all the way to Sacramento, even though the jet was going to Reno. But nonetheless, the pilots had complete discretion to fly the route any way they wanted to. They could make any kind of changes they wanted to. And in fact, they were kind of expected to do that. So Cliff Ammerman, who was responsible for, at that point, the chase planes and keeping everybody away from that skyjacked airliner, said he was relieved to see that the jet took that turn, represented by number 1 there, the blue line there, and the red number 1 there. He was relieved to see the jet make a turn there at Melee and start heading toward Battleground, because that indicated to him that he was taking this Victor 23 airway. So that makes Cliff's job a lot easier with respect to managing the F-106s that are behind Flight 305, and also keeping other traffic away from the skyjacked airliner, because he was a little concerned about that. But he was relieved to see that happened. So that's why he remembers that turn. And in fact, upon talking with Cliff about this, I get the impression that it was Cliff and a couple other people, including, I assume, his supervisor, that were actually watching the jet as it made that turn at Melee. So that's a pretty solid piece there. So while it appears that the Melee intersection where the blue line makes the turn is close to the Toledo point where the FBI map shows the turn being made, it's about 6 miles apart. It's a good 6 to 7 miles apart there. So it's further apart than it may appear. And this is critically important, because if for no other reason, if I can just prove that the FBI flight path is wrong at that one spot, then it calls into question the veracity of the path going all the way down, of course. If it can be wrong there, why can't it be wrong somewhere else, a little further south? So now Cliff also told me that he recalls that as the jet was traveling along this Victor 23 airway, which is probably hard to see, but it's a very faint line actually depicted on the map there. He said that he recalls it, the airliner flying a little to the west of it most of the time, a little to the west of it. Now, I don't know what that means, 1 mile to the west, 2 miles to the west, but for my purposes, I drew a line on the map here, that blue line, that is basically 1.5 miles or so to the west of the airway, just trying to account for what the air traffic controller said he recalled seeing that evening. Now, you see the FBI flight path actually shows the jet on the other side, a little bit to the east of the center line of this Victor 23 airway. So that's another discrepancy there. Now, what Cliff says is that he recalls the jet, and in his mind, he recalls it being near that red 2, that number 2 there, like the FBI map depicts. He recalls about as far south as that, maybe not that far east, but as far as somewhere around that area, the airliner making a right-hand turn and heading to the southwest. The problem is he doesn't recall the turn being too terribly sharp. Now you can see that the FBI flight path has it actually turning relatively sharply, heading in a pretty drastic different direction toward the southwest. And Cliff basically theorized that what was going on there, that what the pilots were trying to do, and there's a couple of reasons to believe this, that they were actually trying to fly around Portland and Vancouver. In other words, they didn't want to fly right over the top of the city, because they had an airliner that, as far as they know, has a bomb on board, and who knows what's going to happen. So here's where there's a little bit of a problem with Cliff's version about things, is that if the jet actually flew as far south as is kind of depicted, on the FBI flight path there, near that red number 2, and made a right-hand turn and actually swooped around the cities, that would be a very sharp turn, and he doesn't recall that being the case. So what I did is I actually moved the line a little bit further up. You can see the blue line kind of departs a little bit before then and heads in a little bit straighter direction, or heads to the southwest, but not quite as dramatic as you can see on the FBI flight path. And I have it going directly to this area where there are some red plots that somebody plotted on this map but never used. And that's one of the mysteries of this map, is what do those red apparent radar plots indicate? Now, those red radar plots are near the red number 3 that I have there on the map. And you can see I have the blue line kind of basically my version of the flight path, kind of swooping down toward that area and actually crossing over the top of those red radar plots. I don't know why those weren't used. I don't know why they're there. Nobody does, but I suspect that there was sort of some mixed data going on there, and that those red plots are actually more accurate than apparently the plots that they ultimately used to craft the FBI flight path. So while in one sense having the blue line depart the way I have it depart there doesn't really mesh with Cliff Ammerman's recollection of maybe the jet flying a little further south before it made the right-hand turn. But on the other hand, it satisfies his other recollection, which is, though it wasn't a dramatically sharp turn, and that the jet flew around the city. And it also happens to, line up with those red X's, like I said, that those radar plots that were kind of unused. And importantly as well, when you're talking about this T-33, Oregon Air National Guard T-33, swooping around and pulling in behind Flight 305, according to Cliff Ammerman, that occurred somewhere near where that number 3 is, that red number 3 is, somewhere near where those red radar plots are. So again, there's a little bit of, like, when you listen to Cliff and you talk to him about things, there are certain areas that just don't quite add up. So something's not exactly correct, and that makes sense because it's been 52 years. It also makes sense because what he's looking at is just a black screen, basically. It doesn't have the kind of detail that this map has. And you'll notice something on this map as well, that I've got the sort of the two equal signs, the white equal signs, talking about the radar target being 4 mile wide. That's a representation of basically what the target looked like, what the airliner, and frankly what the F-106, a lead F-106 looked like flying down south, flying to the south. So it's important to understand that this is 1971, so the radar instrumentation wasn't nearly as precise as it is today. So when Cliff is looking at the jets moving south on this black screen, he effectively sees an equal sign or a couple of equal signs like you've got represented there. And those equal signs, he says that on the leading slash, it's on the leading slash, that's where the jet is located. Now, for their purposes, they assume it's in the middle of that slash. They assume that the jet is literally sitting in the middle of that slash, even though from one side of the slash to the other represents a distance of about 4 miles in that area. And in reality, the jet could be anywhere along that line. The jet could be a couple miles to the west of the center of the slash, or it could be a couple miles to the east of the center of the slash. So it could be anywhere along that 4 mile area. So you can see that there's a fair amount of play and a fair amount of variance there, so you can't be absolutely certain where the jet was. So factoring in everything that Cliff Ammerman said, and bearing in mind that some of this stuff doesn't quite mesh entirely accurately, there are conflicts kind of baked into it. I think that the version of the flight path that I've drawn here is actually the most accurate, because it's similarly shaped to the FBI flight path. You can clearly see it's similarly shaped, especially if you're just looking at a black screen. But importantly, if you look at that blue line and you look at it, you see that it flies very near where the money was found on Tina Bar, as it's heading toward those red radar plots that were never used for whatever reason. So and the timing works out as well. So I think that that blue line is clearly the most accurate version of the flight path, and it really checks those boxes. It does a good job of basically meeting Cliff's criteria, mostly, not entirely, to be clear about that. But it also checks the box with respect to that Cinnabar hunting ground area, And very importantly, it checks the box with respect to having DB Cooper land very near where a portion of the ransom was found in February of 1980. And again, that's critically important there. Now, there's a couple of other interesting things that I should mention as well, and that relates to the FBI flight path line. Well, what is it? How did it get there? I mean, what's the story with that thing? Because obviously it represents something. Well, I firmly believe that what that flight path line actually represents is not the track of the airliner, Flight 305. Rather, I believe it's the track of the lead F-106 chase plane that came out of McChord Air Force Base. Now, what happened is they had two chase planes, two of these F-106 chase planes out of McChord Air Force Base, and they were traveling quite close to each other, the two chase planes, but they were about 6 miles behind Flight 305. They never made visual eye contact with the airliner. The reason why is because at the altitude they were, which is the chase planes were at 11,000 feet, the airliner was at 10,000 feet, but they were in the clouds. So it was cloudy, so they couldn't see it. It was obviously dark as well. So that's the thing. They never made visual eye contact. The other thing is that the chase planes traveled too fast. They couldn't fly as slow as the airliner was traveling, which is about 195 miles an hour, roughly, basically. So what ended up happening is Cliff had to manage these two chase planes. And basically, he would have them do a series of S-turns as they were trailing behind Flight 305, S-turns to effectively slow them down. And that got very labor intensive. It was very labor intensive for Cliff. In fact, Cliff, when I talked with him about this, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, one of the things he said when I asked him about some of the apparent conflicts with his memory of the flight path, but some of the other conditions that had to be met. And he was very clear. He said, well, the important thing to remember, and this is according to Cliff, is that he was spending an awful lot of time focusing on those fighter jets and communicating in particular with the lead fighter jet, make 30-degree turn here, and then after a period of time, make 60 degrees going back, then 60 degrees going back. And he said, though, so his exact words are, he didn't spend a lot of time looking at the airliner. He said most of his energy, most of his mind was focused on those fighter jets. Not as much time was spent looking at the Flight 305. So that's what he said. So that makes sense. And that can explain why, maybe there's some variance with respect to some things. But the larger thing to remember here, and I found this very interesting, is that because the F-106s had to make these S-turns and they had to remain at least 6 miles behind, it was a problem. It created a problem. So what ended up happening is there was a T-33, Oregon Air National Guard T-33 that took off from, from Portland Airport that Cliff Ammerman also took control of, and he swooped that around behind Flight 305, about 5 miles behind. And that jet was capable, did possess the ability to fly much slower, and it could basically trail the hijacked airliner. Now, again, same sort of thing. It couldn't make visual contact, but it was a lot easier because it could just simply fly behind it. Now, at the time, as Cliff was having that T-33 pulling behind the airliner, 5 miles behind, it was at the same time that Cliff had the F-106s veer off to the southeast, head off in that direction to give some greater separation between them and the airliner and everything else. And they were basically now flying 10 miles to the side of the airliner, and they would kind of pass it up and then turn around and come back. And they were kind of like doing loop-to-loop circles, flying alongside. But they, again, never made contact with him, visual contact with Flight 305. But interestingly, what Cliff mentioned to me is that the angle that the jets he had peel off and fly to the southeast, he said was basically the angle that's depicted on the FBI flight path there, leading up to that red number 2. So if you look at the red number 2 and you see the line that's kind of an angle approaching red number 2, he said, he actually pointed out to me, he said, yeah, that angle there is about the angle that the jets took off at, that he directed them to take off at. So it's for that reason and for many others there that I believe what we have actually depicted there is not, again, it's not the flight path for Flight 305, but rather it's for the F-106. I think it's the fighter jet, the F-106. And there's been a lot of discussion about what radar was used, how are these things tracked, SAGE radar and everything else. There is zero in the FBI files, there's nothing at all that indicates what data, what raw data was used, what information the United States Air Force used to track the path. That information was never released, the raw data was never released. We know nothing of it. There's nothing in the files at all that reference anything related to that. In fact, SAGE really, for the purposes of the map, is really only mentioned one time that has any kind of significance. And there's a document, a single document that talks about the unit at SAGE. So the SAGE unit at the Air Force is the group that put together, that ultimately crunched the numbers and came up with the FBI flight path. And in January of 1972, so again a few months after the skyjacking, a couple months later, they were actually tasked to review that data again to see if they could come up with even more precise flight path, because obviously they weren't finding anything where they should have been finding something. So that's the only reference to SAGE. Now, people have assumed, and I believe have assumed wrongly, that SAGE was tracking, that the SAGE system, that's a military system that's used by NORAD to keep an eye on incoming Soviet bombers and fighters and that kind of thing back during the Cold War. People have assumed that therefore SAGE must have been used to track Flight 305. That is not the case. I think that is an incorrect assumption. First of all, NORAD was not involved with this. NORAD was not trying to intercept Flight 305 or anything of that nature. If they had been, NORAD would have had control of the F-106 fighters. They would have had a controller at NORAD that would have been directing the jets and would have been controlling that whole thing. That's not what happened. Those jets and all the jets, including the T-33 and the airliner, were controlled by Seattle Air Traffic Control, specifically Cliff Ammerman, until they got further south, and then Oakland Air Traffic Control took it over. So this was not a NORAD operation. It didn't involve NORAD. Therefore, why would it involve SAGE? Again, this isn't a Soviet bomber or an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile or anything coming into the United States. This is just a guy who wanted 200 grand with skyjacking an airline. It's just simple as that. So that's important to understand, that indicates right there that this was not a NORAD operation. And what SAGE does, this is important to understand what SAGE does. SAGE is a network, and it's obsolete now, so it's not in use now, but SAGE is a network, basically a heavy-duty computer network that had the ability to synthesize radar data from a number of stations up and down the coast or what have you, to quickly synthesize that data and determine in real time the path that, for example, a Soviet bomber would be taking. And SAGE had the ability, again, 1971, to actually upload that information directly into the autopilot of an F-106 and fly that F-106 directly to the target to intercept the target, let's say a Soviet bomber, for example, and actually fire upon the target, the Soviet bomber. That's what SAGE does. Obviously, if SAGE was involved with tracking Flight 305, and obviously coordinating that information to the F-106s, there would be no need for Cliff Ammerman to have these guys making S-turns and everything. This would have been all controlled by NORAD and a controller there, and SAGE would have automatically directed the F-106s directly to the target. That is not what happened. Therefore, it is reasonable to deduce that SAGE was not involved with this thing, was not tracking the airliner in real time. Why would it? This is not a NORAD intercept situation. This is not to suggest that The Air Force wasn't watching the activity on the radar screen, no different than Cliff Ammerman was watching these targets on the radar screen, or people at Portland Tower at the Portland Airport were watching it. But watching these marks, these jets travel down on a radar screen, a black radar screen, is not the same thing. It's not the same thing as tracking it like SAGE tracking it literally in real time and directing automatically via autopilot their F-106 chase planes to intercept directly the target. It's not the same thing. Now here's what I think happened here. There is one part of SAGE that's critically important. I think this is why SAGE, the unit at SAGE, was involved with putting together this flight path, which took a couple of days, by the way. And that is that SAGE also had the ability that when an F-106 actually reached the target, like the F-106s here were in the 6 miles behind the airliner, it had the ability to actually have the fighter transmit information back to, in this case, McChord Air Force Base. So the fighter jets, once they're trailing behind, could actually transmit data and information back to McChord. Now, that information that that's transmitting back is obviously not the same sort of stuff that the SAGE synthesized computer network is coming up with and then uploading so they can direct directly to a target. It's a different kind of thing, obviously. So I suspect that what happened here, and this is my theory, I suspect that what happened here is that when it came time, after the skyjacking was over, to plot the map, try to figure out the precise path that the airliner took, that the SAGE unit at McChord Air Force Base worked with that data that was coming back, that stream of data that was coming back from the F-106 chase planes as the chase planes got into position 6 miles behind the airliner. And that's what they were using, that data, whatever kind of form that data took, they used to ultimately plot out some of the X's and so forth. And that's what was plotted. So again, that would clearly show that the map, the FBI flight path map, is actually a fair and accurate representation, reasonably fair, of the path that the F-106s took, at least up to a certain period of time, not the airliner itself. And I think that's the problem there. And again, like I said, a lot of people have assumed incorrectly that this big comprehensive NORAD SAGE system was tracking and targeting Flight 305. There is zero evidence to support that. Nothing at all. So there you go. That's basically what we're working with here. So I think that the blue line here represents the most accurate version of the flight path. And obviously it's critically important because it helps explains how DB Cooper managed to get away. Simply put, they're just searching in the wrong area. They were searching in an area based upon the FBI flight path. They weren't searching an area based upon what was the actual flight path. The blue line here, I call it the ULIS flight path. The hell, I'll name it after myself. So that's what I think happened there. And the other thing is that it also explains how the money ended up at Tina Bar. It makes a lot of sense if the guy landed a mile or two from that area. It makes a lot of sense that some of the money would have been found there, that he would have stashed it in the area, the vicinity, before he walked into Portland. So it's critically important and it makes an awful lot of sense. Why this is also important is it gives us an idea of where we can continue to search to try to find the parachute that DB Cooper jumped with. There's no reason to think, there's no reason to believe that he lugged that parachute out with him. It's too heavy, too cumbersome. He didn't own it. It was unnecessary for him to take it anywhere once he landed on the ground. So I believe that the parachute is stashed very near where the money was found. Now, interestingly, one of the new and interesting things about this updated flight path here is that, according to my estimations, just looking at the path, I think it's also, for the first time, I've seriously entertained the fact that perhaps DB Cooper landed due east of the money find spot, or maybe even a little south of the money find spot. In other words, maybe he landed about half a mile or so south of the money find spot and then walked up to the beach and buried the money. I always assumed before that he had landed north and basically walking toward Vancouver, toward civilization, he just pulled off to the beach and buried the money. But I think that this version of the flight path indicates that that may not be the case, that he may have landed a little south of it. And it's important to note as well that if you take a really close look at that area, and I'm very familiar with the area, there are a lot of sort of retention pond trenches, that kind of thing, that are overgrown. They're kind of like little channels or canyons, I guess is how I would put them. And they're overgrown with blackberry bushes, sticker bushes, other kind of vegetation, and they are impenetrable. I mean, you're not walking through there. You're not getting down in there and walking in there. So why that's important is because it makes sense to me that if Cooper landed in an open field, he would probably immediately scurry to the edge of the woods, one of these areas, take the stuff off, take the parachutes and all that stuff off, and just chuck them in there, and they'd still be sitting there today, 52 years later. Nobody's been in there. Nobody's looked for them. So that's a prime area to look, and I'll be searching in that area there as well. The other thing is there's one of these particular trenches or channels that actually starts out in the field and kind of heads off in a northwesterly direction. So what I'm trying to say here is that if Cooper landed, let's say, slightly to the north of this particular trench, he would still be south of the money find spot. But as he started walking to the west toward the Columbia River, let's say he had to walk a mile or a mile and a half to get to the Columbia River, that trench, that overgrowth there, naturally corrals him and forces him to kind of walk up in a northwesterly direction. And if you follow that trench all the way up, where the trench ends is literally at the entrance to the Fazio's sand and gravel area, which is where the money was found. It was found on their property on Tina Bar on the beach. So it begins to make sense in that respect as well. You can understand how DB Cooper landing in a field and walking in this area, discarding one of the parachutes, and then walking to the west with the bag of money because he knows he has to bury it for a period of time. You can see how he just naturally ends up right there at the Fazio's sand and gravel area. There's no other place he really could end up. So there we go. I know this was kind of a long video, but I think it's critically important, and I think for the first time it explains what happened and how it happened. There you go. So I think that this blue line is actually the most accurate version of the actual flight path that the jet flew, and I'm running with that. And so all my searching and everything related to trying to find missing parachutes and all that stuff are going to center around an area near where the money was found. It makes sense to me, an area that was never searched by the authorities, amazingly. I would have thought that when they found the money there, 8 years after the event, that somebody would have said, you know what? If we can find money in this area where it's not supposed to be, maybe we can find something else in the area that's not supposed to be here, like a parachute. So I would have thought that they would have done more than just search the immediate beach area, that they would have actually taken the time to kind of search that island that Tina Bar is on, that they would have searched out 1 or 2 miles from that area to see if there's anything else they could have found. But they didn't do it. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to be doing with a group of people in the coming months and so forth, seeing what we can find, because I am absolutely convinced that that parachute is still sitting there today, very near where the money was found. Mile and a half, 2 miles, something like that. So there you go. All right, folks, as usual, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, cheers.